to stay.
Hello and welcome back to Beyond Boards, a podcast dedicated to the actions and interests of skaters beyond skateboarding. My guest today, Sander Hölsgens, started skating in the early 2000s in a small town in the southeast of Holland. Aside from his passion for skateboarding, Sander developed a strong interest for academia and completed his PhD in architectural design and anthropology at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London in 2018. He labels himself as a skateboarding anthropologist, which he defines later in our conversation. He is also one of the co-founders and organizers of the famous Pushing Borders events, which took place in London in 2018 and in Malmö in 2019. Today he teaches at the University of Leiden, close to The Hague, and is involved in many other projects in and out of skateboarding. So here's my conversation with Sander. I hope you'll enjoy it. Yeah, I usually start these interviews the same way with every guest, and of course start at their beginning with skateboarding. And so, yeah, can you tell me about picking up your first board? And so you're from Holland, and
yes.
I'm actually not too sure where you're living. I think you're in the area of The Hague. Are you around there or not at all?
Yeah, so I'm currently based in Rotterdam, where I moved just before the pandemic started. But I grew up in the southeast of the Netherlands, close to the German border, in a small town called Kerkrade. Probably not many people know about it. It's a similar story actually to Candy Jacobs, who's also growing up in the same province, in a small town, almost like first-gen skater in that region. Mm-hmm. So I started in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, and, around that time, like many people probably, we were playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, like watching Jackass, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So me and a few friends, it was kind of the final year of elementary school, we were really inspired, and we're like, oh, we have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So we went to our local I think it was a toys store, and we purchased our first skateboard, which was this really awful, almost like plastic deck.
Like banana board, kind of, yeah.
Exactly. So we started skating, and we had no other reference points other than, Tony Hawk and also, of course, the MTV clips and those kinds of media representations. And we were the first ones in our town to skate. And luckily for us, there was this massive public space really where lots of these music events were organized, mostly during the weekends. But then throughout the week, no one was using that. So we could actually skate without any interruptions.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, so that was really cool. And within a year or so, we kind of went to Germany to a proper skate store. I think it was kind of owned by Supreme at the time.
Okay.
And I got my first board, which like a proper skateboard, which was by kind of the Zero Dying to Live line. I think it was a Chris Cole board, 7.5 inch, like really.
Oh wow! Super
hardcore.
Skinny.
Yes, exactly. And that's really when I started to kind of skate more.
How old were you
regularly.
at this point when you started?
Yeah, so when I started, I was 11, 12. And then, the first board, the Zero board, was probably around the time of Dying to Live, which is 2002. So
right.
12-ish. And, the first skaters in our town, of course, we got lots of encounters with police officers and local authorities and residents who were kind of upset. And so like, but you folks, you shouldn't hang out here. You should go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But there was nowhere else to go. There was no skate park. We didn't really have the means to travel to larger cities, so we tried to negotiate, our place within that kind of community. Mm-hmm. And, this is also the time when I noticed that I was not too bad at negotiating with these people and being really polite and saying like, yeah, but that skateboarding is good for our well-being and for our health. And, I was just making stuff up. I didn't read any academic literature on skateboarding, but just kind of trying to kind of find our place there. Mm-hmm. So around that time, I started skating. And I'm not sure if that's the same where you're from in France, but around that kind of time, there was also this kind of upheaval of more like extreme right, neo-Nazi kind of movements, youth movements. That was at least the case in the southeast of the Netherlands and also these western kind of regions of Germany. Okay. And so there were lots of these kids who were kind of their late teens who were heavily influenced by those movements, who were then using the same kinds of spaces as we were.
Oh, okay.
So that led to some kind of confrontations, and because we were easy targets, we were young, we were skinny, we didn't really know anything about about the world.
Mm-hmm.
So that happened around the time as well. And I think the funny thing is, and I've told this story a bit, during these academic conferences, and is that many of the police officers, they couldn't really differentiate between us as skaters and then these youth, which were more deviant than we were, and who had particular kind of political of preferences.
They kind of all put you in the same bag, kind of?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly, and that really was the first encounter with this sense of injustice. Like, hey, but this is not about us, but we are still clustered together with these folks that actually think really differently than we do, and that do have these toxic kind of behaviors and stuff. Yeah, anyway, so that's the time frame in which I started skating.
And so I kind of tried to ask this in recent episodes, but I'm curious to know like what my guests' first magazine and first video have been, because I feel like that's influential in how they continue skateboarding in the future. So do you remember maybe what was the first magazine and the first video you watched?
I mean, the first proper video for sure was Dying to Live, Zero, and I was particularly influenced by John Rattray's part, which I thought was really amazing, and the music was awesome. This was really the first part that I probably saw and that I had a VHS tape of. And I got into, basically the usual stuff, then Girl, You're Right, and America, This is Skateboarding, those kinds of videos in the first few years. But the funny thing is, in terms of skate magazines, that didn't really happen until much later. I don't know exactly why. I don't know if it was because that skate store didn't have many. I assume they did have some, but I never really engaged with any skate magazines. So no Treasure for me until much later.
Okay.
So mainly the skate videos that I did watch, yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned Zero, and because John Rattray was definitely like the kind of, he stood out from the whole Zero crew. I mean, of course, he's a gnarly skater, he can skate big gaps, big rails, whatever, but he's also extremely creative. So like his part definitely stood out. Is that something that kind of appealed to you at that time, that he was different from the rest, basically?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, like retrospectively it's easy to say, right? But I never really got into skating the massive stair sets and huge rails and those kinds of stuff. And of course he does some of it.
Yeah.
But I was more interested in, how can we think a bit more creatively with our bodies and these weird kind of in-between tricks movements that he did. And I really loved that. And I remember that many of my friends are like, but if he's really your favorite, what about Chris Cole? He can skate like a 20 set. Mm-hmm. Like, but is that really what this is all about? Right? Yeah. So I already had that kind of inclination towards creativity, kind of different kinds of embodiments in skating, not necessarily showing these fails. And of course now I've met him in Malmö. Maybe we get to speak about that in a minute. But now I also know that he's this amazing person too. Yeah. Which of course I didn't know at the time. I just saw that one skate video.
Sure.
But maybe there's some kind of subjectivity or personality that shines through in skate videos. Yeah.
Yeah, also his part is probably the one that people could relate to the most. Like Chris Cole on the opposite spectrum is a level of skating and technicality of skating that is just incomprehensible. At least when I saw it as a teenager, I remember being shocked and amazed, but also just like, okay, like this is out of my reach. This is from another world, basically. Whereas a part like John Rattray's was definitely much more relatable, and you felt like you could, like the snow comply does super fast in a line is like something like stylish, and that I feel like I could do maybe if I try, if I put the effort into. Like that's more accessible than a kickflip backside nose blunt slide on a 10-star rail or something. Yeah. So
no, I fully resonates. I mean, I could never do anything that that John did. I'm nowhere near that kind of level. But the kind of tricks that he did, but then also the kinds of spots that he chose. Those are much more accessible, and even in a small town in the Netherlands where you don't really have the kind of architecture that you have in LA or in San Francisco or none of these, or even London or Berlin. We didn't really have much of that, but we did have like small slopes and some flat ground and some weird handrails. So that was also kind of trying to emulate or mimic or replicate what he did. I think because it was more accessible, it felt closer to what I could imagine myself doing. Yeah.
And so while you were growing up and skating, did you have kind of like every skater, I guess, like the hopes or the dream of becoming like a pro skater or just getting sponsored maybe one day or stuff like that? Or did you always feel like this is probably like out of my reach and I'd rather just keep skating and having fun with it and not, worry about trying to get that good basically?
Yeah, so I mean, initially it was really hard to kind of tell what kind of level we were on because we were the only kids in that town. But then the moment, when I turned like 13, 14, that kind of age, and our crew, started to travel to these cities like Cologne or Maastricht or Eindhoven, which are kind of within an hour's kind of trip, we realized that there were people even within the Netherlands that are much better than we were. So I gave up that hope quite soon. But then also I was more interested in just documenting my friends' lives and the stuff that we did. And so I recall that I borrowed my dad's, 8mm camera, which was from the early 90s and only had like, a 30-minute charge, if you would really fully charge the battery. So we had to be very cautious as to what we would film.
Yeah,
but
sure.
That's something that I really loved. And not just focus on the tricks, but then also just the way that we were hanging out together, how we were kind of exploring the city, the trips that we took. And so that really was my thing, So I think around the age of 14, I got my own camera, which was this mini DV camera, the Sony Handycam style, and I continued skating, but then also I spent a lot of time filming. Documenting.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's a bit later in life, but like I'm interested in hearing about you getting into academia.
Yeah.
And I had kind of a question before that's linked to that, but like I was wondering how good of a student you were as a teenager before you became like an academic, because like I started skating at 13 in the year 2000, and I had this false perception, but that if you are a skater, you need to focus on skating. Like you cannot be interested in anything else. Like if you're interested in sports or in school or literature or whatever, anything else, then you're not 100% skater, and then you're not part of this like community basically.
Yeah.
That was my perception of it. And so I don't know if I voluntarily did this, but I basically did not focus on school and was a terrible student and just pretty much failed school pretty much. But yeah, so I was wondering, like, what was your perception of that growing up, and how good of a student were you? And then we'll talk about you getting into academia.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so I never really studied much. During high school, I was just skating all day. And the point is, I'm a morning person, so I would wake up really early, like 5:30, and I just go through my French and, practice for this test. And I would pass, but I was skating most of the day, so I was not really studying. However, what I noticed early on, what I said before, is that one of the things I realized is that I'm, all right in actually explaining why skateboarding is not a disaster for a city and negotiating with authorities and with residents and stuff. And so I felt as though it was my responsibility to actually read up on that. Why should we need skaters for a city? How can we use public space in a way that is maybe not expected from residents? So I spent a lot of time, doing some research on that, even, during my teenage years. So it was not related to my studies, but it was something that I felt this kind of innate kind of responsibility for my peers as well. Like, hey, I want us to continue doing this stuff.
Oh, that's interesting. So this like desire kind of came very early then.
Yeah. Exactly. And so your question was about how I turned into kind of an academic or my studies. So I always perceived, going to university and stuff as it was not just this intellectual trickery. It was always related to real life stuff. And I wanted to kind of connect it to the practices that I was involved in. Because I thought like, hey, all the literature or all the papers that are out there, even the videos that academics made or at the time, like radio recordings that these academics did, those are all like such an amazing source of knowledge for my activism. So there was always this practical urgency for me to study, to in a way study cultural studies, to figure out like what the hell are we doing as skaters? Like who are we? What is this weird thing that we do with this wooden toy, and why do we care so much about it?
Yeah.
And that kind of passion or desire, or however you want to call it, I think made me not too bad of a student, because I really cared deeply about all of this stuff. But then whenever I had to read stuff that I thought like, well, this is really ridiculous and outdated and not worthy of my time, I would just skip it and I would accept the bad grade. So I was a bit like dependent on my personal commitment to a particular subject.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you found like a purpose and like a meaning. Yeah, you basically found something that you were interested in very early on, and then you put all your energy into that, basically.
Yes.
And disregarded the things that you felt were not interesting or not valuable or...
Yes, and I recall this conversation with my dad. I hope he doesn't listen, but around the time, halfway through my high school in the Netherlands, you have to choose a particular specialization. You have like culture and the arts, or like more like the STEM, like science and technology, physics. And he wanted me to choose something that would have future potential for jobs, like economics or, physics or biology, those kinds of subjects. And I saw the value, but I didn't see the value for me personally. It was not something that I was passionate about. And so I really wanted to kind of go into the arts and kind of the cultural subjects and philosophy and humanities, social sciences. And I recall we had these long conversations like, yeah, but Dad, I would never want to become a doctor or, medical doctor. So why would I ever study this?
Yeah.
And eventually he agreed to me doing this. And he was a bit, I think, skeptical of what this would lead to. But then, this is much later. Then, I think in 2018, he actually visited me in London during Pushing Borders, and he saw the amount of people who joined and the subjects that we discussed and kind of the passion that we all felt for skateboarding, but then also more generally for the way that we want to structure our lives and society. Yeah. And after Pushing Borders, we had a chat. I think we had dinner at his place, and he said I now understand what you said 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So that was this really beautiful moment.
That's amazing.
Kind of came together,
And so I saw that you did a BA in Arts and Culture and then a Master of Arts in Visual Anthropology, I think in England.
Yeah.
And then you did a PhD. But yeah, so can you take me through maybe those first few years of studying, and then we'll talk about the PhD and what you've been doing after the PhD.
Yeah, of course. So I really decided to study arts and culture because I was interested in social inequalities and basically what we were just discussing. And that was a course that was really interdisciplinary, and it touched upon so many different subjects, from philosophy to anthropology and, media studies, all these kinds of things. And it was close to my hometown. I wasn't really ready yet to move away that far from my parents' place, to be honest. And I had an amazing time. And I then, during my studies, got the opportunity to do an exchange program at an international university. And I got into this university in South Korea where I spent 6 months when I was 19, I believe.
Okay.
Which was really fantastic, and got to learn first steps into Korean as a language, Korean culture, but then also kind of my first introduction to the Korean skate scene, which was quite small at the time. And I didn't really think much of it except for this is an amazing time, let's enjoy it.
Yeah.
And when I came back from that exchange program, besides my bachelor's, I also joined the Dutch Photo Academy to kind of practice documentary photography, because I had been taking pictures and making films, but I wanted to kind of see if I could do that on a more professional level. So that was really a practical set of courses that I took. But those were still really kind of different from one another. So my university studies, really theoretical, abstract, writing papers, and then going to Photo Academy where I kind of produce these photo series and stuff. And then for one of the graduation projects, I stumbled upon this field of visual anthropology, which basically was combining both, which was saying okay, you get to spend months and months of field work among a small community, and besides writing a paper, you can also produce audiovisual work, and we count that as academically relevant.
Okay.
So this is really, this discipline that suits me and that fits me. And yeah, I decided to go to the UK, to Manchester, where I studied visual anthropology for just over a year. And for my graduation project, I decided to go to Korea. I had been going on and off to Korea for some documentary projects, particularly on family life and food culture, so not related to skateboarding at all. But then for my master's project, I decided to really delve into, skate culture. And I recall like meeting Ian Borden during my studies in Manchester. I traveled to London and just like okay, I have to meet this amazing scholar who's writing about skateboarding, urban space, resilience, all of these kinds of topics that I thought were fascinating from a more like progressive Marxist point of view. Anyway, so I met up with him, I got really inspired and did my fieldwork in Korea for 4 months, which I really enjoyed and got to know the skate community in Seoul much better. And eventually, continued my collaboration with Ian and turned that master's project into, a full-fledged, 4-year-long PhD project. And I hadn't really planned to do this. I didn't even know really what a PhD entailed and how much work it takes if I'd only known. No, but then, I moved to UCL where Ian was based. And officially I was part of the architecture department because he is a professor of urban culture in the architecture department. So I was based there as well, half there and half at the anthropology department. And yeah, really kind of focused on what makes skateboarding in Seoul, site specific, or what is the situated components of skateboarding there. Because in literature at the time, you had some studies in Japan and South Africa, a few, one in Cambodia, but most of the literature that I saw was really kind of suggesting that skateboarding, besides some kind of minor sociocultural differences, is still this universal practice that we all learn to see the city in the same way. We all see a stair set in the same way as skaters. And, being trained in cultural studies and anthropology, I was a bit skeptical of that notion. So my question was really simple. Like, do skaters in Seoul learn to see the city differently compared to the kind of dominant ways of the literature at that time? Anyway, so I spent 4 years at UCL. I had an amazing time. I think one of the best years in my life so far. It was just such a great period. Ian is an amazing mentor, also skater, a supervisor. A couple of years in, Tom Callan Riley joined the PhD program as well. And I think he's the kindest person that I know, beyond just a good, amazing academic too. But yeah, so we had this little community of skaters working in academia. And that was really this kind of moment at which I started to think like, hey, this is maybe something that I could turn into a proper career,
So your thesis for the PhD was around skating in Seoul.
Yes.
Did you travel there, I assume, some more during your PhD to do some research over there, or?
Yeah. So between, I think, 2011 and 2018, I spent about half of my time in Korea, mostly in periods of 4, 5 to 8 months. And yeah, so it was really kind of, that's what anthropologists do, these kind of longer term fieldwork projects. I just wanted to skip the hot summers. I cannot really stand the humidity, so I tried to plan it in such a way that I could be there in the spring or the winter or the fall, but not the summers.
Sure.
But yeah, so I spent half of my time in Korea and half of my time in the UK, where I was, writing my thesis, teaching as well, working on some collaborative projects. I set up this film collective with some other PhDs, which was not related to skateboarding, but really related to kind of the filmic representation of urban space and architecture.
Yeah.
And so I think the final kind of few months of fieldwork were in 2017 for my PhD. And then when I returned in June 2017, I, started to kind of pull everything together for my book.
Right.
And I needed a bit of a side project because, if you're working on a book, I've talked to, Kyle Beachy or Danny and people who've also written books. And I think everyone's saying the same thing, where you get this tunnel vision, you're just focusing on the book and everything else disappears from your life.
Yeah.
And just to stay sane, I was thinking about, how can I do something more interesting with skateboarding that is not just going to be read by 2 people. And initially I started to think about, if I have my PhD viva, so when you're defending your dissertation or your thesis, you have your examiners there, but in the UK it's just your examiners and your supervisors, no public kinds of event.
Sure.
And so I thought like, well, maybe it would be nice, next to Tom, to also invite some other skate scholars. I'd met Paul O'Connor, who was based in Hong Kong at the time, or Adelina Ong, who was also based in London, to bring together some skate academics. And Tom was also starting, to write some stuff for his PhD. And so we started to collaborate on that project.
Mm-hmm.
And but now we're getting into the pushing border stuff, I guess. But around that time, so that was, I think, the summer of 2017, Tom went to this like skate video premiere. I can't remember what video it was. I wasn't there, but he met Theo Krish from Skate Pal.
Oh, yeah.
And found out that they were basically doing something similar but for skate charities. So within a couple of weeks, we decided like, hey, let's join forces and see where we could take this.
Okay.
And to be honest, the second half of 2017, I spent more time on pushing borders than my actual thesis. So I basically rode a couple of hours during the mornings, teach a bit, and then most of the day was really about, okay, how do we get funds together? How do we do this? Like, do we have a template for put something together? We didn't really know what it was, whom to invite, where to get money from. And to be fair, working for such a long time on a project like a PhD and then specifically on something that you care for, like skateboarding, I was happy that I could do something in a team, because otherwise I think it would have been detrimental to my mental health. I think I would have been like burned out of skateboarding afterwards. And now there was this almost like organic transition into, a collaborative project, which didn't there were at the time no high stakes, no one expected anything from us. So it was just this little fun project.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in December 2017, I submitted my thesis. I got a few months off, traveled to California, where I lived for a few months with my partner at the time.
Okay.
And from there, I continued working on pushing borders, and then came back in March or something, or April, I think, 2018, a few months before the first event. I moved back to the Netherlands and did some kind of commuting between the Netherlands and London until the first edition. Yeah, that's kind of how it was, for me.
We'll talk about pushing borders in a second, but I wanted to ask you also, just if you could maybe define for the listeners, like I saw, I think on your LinkedIn, or maybe it was on your Instagram, I don't remember where I saw this, but you basically titled yourself a skateboarding anthropologist.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you could explain in a few words what that means, what that represents.
Yeah. I listened to Dania Bulawa's podcast a few weeks ago that you did, the interview you did with her, and that really resonated with me in the sense that whenever I would present my research at academic conferences, people would really look funny at me and would be like, but my son skates, or have you heard of Tony Hawk? All of these bullshit comments. Whereas actually, I wanted to talk about actually like urban studies theory, or, I wanted to be talking about like, okay, but what is the critical potential of my research film that I was making? Or talk a bit more about how we can think differently about failure, or those kinds of things, about masculinity or about cultural difference. I wanted to really talk about these issues that are really important and relate skateboarding to those issues. Mm-hmm. And that work at the time was not really taken seriously. I was just being made fun of at these conferences. And, I'm fine with that. It doesn't really hurt me in any way. I just go to these conferences, present, and some people like it, some people don't. That's fine. But I then really realized that it's important to also pave the way for fellow, skaters to find their way in academia and to be okay with wearing, skate gear while going to class or while teaching. Or, being a skater in all the things that you do and not just put on a different hat, when you're in academia.
Sure.
So I now kind of position that as part of my identity, precisely because I feel as though it helps people who come after me to do something similar for the things that they really care for. And that could be skateboarding, but that can also be other cultural phenomena that are heavily stigmatized. Lots of people working on video games, for instance, they face some similar kinds of backlash, when they present stuff. And so I feel like it's really important to foreground, I'm a skater, I'm doing research on skateboarding, and it matters. It is important what we do as skate academics. So that's really why I do this. And I feel as though, I don't even know if it's that necessary right now, when I started my PhD in 2014, it's almost 10 years ago, like researching skateboarding was still quite a uncommon practice. And Ian Borden said to me, like, oh, you're my first PhD candidate working on skateboarding. But, now all of these people across the globe, are doing such wonderful work on skateboarding. Mm-hmm. So that's really why I do that. And I also feel as though, I teach at university, of course, also like stuff like filmmaking or how to do ethnography or fieldwork, like the more like content-driven courses.
Yeah.
But I also teach these courses on like personal and professional development for anthropology students. Mm-hmm. And lots of students that I have in my class, they are incredibly passionate for, challenging climate change or like addressing social inequalities. But they still feel as though they have to adjust their ways of living to be accepted by corporates or by NGOs or whatever. And I want to also show to them that you can, do the stuff that you think is important, be accepted, or find a place that actually does appreciate the kinds of things that you're doing. Mm-hmm. So it's also that kind of role that I take quite seriously. Like, hey, be the change that you want to see.
It's activism for sure, yeah.
Yes. Yes. So as an academic, I really feel like an activist on multiple levels. And this is one element of it. Yeah.
Okay.
To normalize that skateboarding is something that on the one hand, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a piece of wood. But on the other hand, if we think about it a bit more critically, it's about how we move our body, how we relate to our environment. It's about social structures, about power relations, all of these really big topics, right?
Sure.
And we can do both at the same time. Have fun, but then also be critical. Yeah.
You just mentioned this project that you've been associated with. I don't know if you're still doing that, but you were the film programmer for this, what is it called? Field recordings? I'm not sure.
Yes, field recordings, yes.
Yeah.
So Field Recordings is this like annual film festival where we present work that is kind of in between anthropology, experimental film, documentary film, anything to do with landscapes in the broader sense of the word. It could be urban landscapes or other types of landscapes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's this program that I put together with a filmmaker and film programmer from Rotterdam called Tim Leyendecker. And it's something that I started around the same time as Pushing Borders in 2018. And, Rotterdam is this really long kind of history of filmmaking and film festivals. You have the International Film Festival in Rotterdam and some other really amazing stuff. Mm-hmm. And this is this really small, niche, weird festival where we present all the kinds of things that don't end up at the International Film Festival, but that we really think is amazing. And, to be honest, it's part of that. We were just talking about my role as an academic. I feel as though I want to really take part in these public debates, and film, I think, is such an awesome medium to do that. To show work that anthropologists or other social scientists or performers or even people from the visual arts have made, and talk about it in a bit more critical way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's this annual event. We sometimes organize an evening program throughout the year. We haven't programmed anything yet on skateboarding, but I have a call with Tim tomorrow, and I've got in my notes, like, okay, by now I should do, this program, whether it's an evening program or weekend program on skateboarding, because I think there's so many awesome, moving images or little kind of video clips that show, skaters in that landscape. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's basically a side project that I do next to my academic work.
And so it's once a year, right? It's
yes,
in the fall.
It's usually in November.
Okay. Will there be a next edition in this coming fall, 2023?
Yes. I mean, so Field Recordings is a bit less erratic than Pushing Borders, also because we don't really have to travel 150 people to one place. So it is an annual event. Usually it takes place in November. We have some invited guests, and I very much like to invite them to my home and just that they can stay over here. I think it's this really nice community-driven effort where we get to know one another quite well over a weekend. Mm-hmm. And it's every year in November, basically. Yeah.
And so let's talk a bit about Pushing Borders. You just mentioned like doing your thesis and finishing that in 2018, and also this film festival, if you can call it like that.
Yeah.
Which started at the same time. So you were doing a lot of stuff around that time, summer of 2018, and that was when the first edition of Pushing Borders happened in London. So can you tell me just about maybe the genesis of Pushing Borders and like the first few people who were involved? You mentioned a bunch of them. You mentioned Tom, Callan Riley. I know that Charlie Davis and Theo Krish from Skatepal were very much involved as well. Stuart McClure from Longley South Bank.
So maybe to preamble this is that what I really learned from that period, you said like I did a lot, and also just to anyone listening who's doing a master's thesis or PhD, don't do this. Don't do anything on the side. It's nice, for having this tunnel vision, but also, you need to take your weekends off or evenings off and stuff like that. And it also showed me the bad side of at least how I relate to skateboarding, which is I'm incredibly disciplined. And that sounds awesome because if I have to grade something, student work, I do that within a couple of days. I cannot stop grading until I finish something. And also when I want to land a trick, I just keep going. Or when I put together a film festival, okay, let's go all the way. But at the same time, this is not necessarily a healthy relationship to anything, right? So anyway, that's just maybe to preamble, because I don't want to romanticize this period. And there are some people who, of course, were part of the core team. And I think you mentioned most of them. I think Charlie Davis really joined for the second edition mainly. It was really Phil Joa from SkatePal who was part of the first edition of Pushing Borders. But I'm thinking about this a lot because I've been doing a few conversations about this, about Pushing Borders, also in Rotterdam. And people who've been asking, like, how did this come together? And all of a sudden I thought, like, oh, this is becoming this kind of origin myth, the origin myth of Pushing Borders, right? And I want to be kind of a bit like remain critical of that, like not to romanticize, like this is the endeavor of a few people, because I think actually there was this moment in skate history where lots of people around the globe were thinking about similar things, right? Like Kristen Ebeling and the Skate Like a Girl crew were already doing amazing work for Wheels of Fortune. And then you've got the Innerskate event that was happening in the US. And that does something really different from Pushing Borders, but there was already this effort, into making skateboarding more visible and talking about social issues in skateboarding. And for first Pushing Borders, I mean, what I can talk about mostly is my own role, which is I was working at UCL at university doing my PhD, collaborating a lot with Ian Borden, and he doesn't really get mentioned a lot in the origin myth of Pushing Borders. He was not organizing, the panels or programming or creating the panels, but he's been a massive help in terms of getting some of the initial funds, for instance. Lots of the funds that we got for the first edition was from UCL. And we positioned it as an academic conference, the first international conference on skateboarding. That was part because, that was what we set out to do, but also for budgetary reasons. We had to position it as a conference because otherwise you wouldn't get academic funds, right? You couldn't just, present like a skate competition or skate festival to a university. So that was one person that I think needs to be mentioned.
Was instrumental.
Yeah, and also just intellectually, he and Ocean Howell and Becky Beale as some of the main figures in skate academia in the 90s, they paved the way for people like us to do this, right? And to be taken seriously. But then also people like Danya Bulawa and the people from the Heavy Discussion team, Jeline Liao, Naftali Williams. Basically what happened is we outsourced lots of the panels to different people who have more expertise on these particular subjects than we did as kind of the core organizers to then kind of take the lead in organizing these panels. And some of it worked really well, I think. And I still, regularly return to Jalene's panel, the Heavy Discussion panel on women in skateboarding. I think that's such a good panel where critical issues are being addressed. And, people like heroes of mine from the past, and still are, like Jamie Reyes and Alyssa Steamer and Lucy Adams are on that panel. I was like, this is amazing. And some panels or some kind of collaborations, worked less well or less effective, right? And but anyway, the point that I want to be making is really this is this collective endeavor that lots of people played a part in, but then the legwork indeed, was done mostly by a few people who are mainly based in the UK. And I think we worked our asses off for a number of months. We drank lots and lots and lots of tea. I've grown to love, British style tea, with milk or soy milk, whatever, during that period. I never liked it. I never liked like black tea with milk, but then, Theo Krish was always making it. We would start a meeting. He was like, let's get some tea. And at first I was like, can you bring me a green tea? But that, after, 10 days of doing that, I also don't want to be
You adjusted to their...
a jackass. I adjusted to the UK kind of...
That was the fuel behind Pushing Borders?
Yes, Quentin. So more than anything, it was anyway, for me, the black tea with milk. And then, of course, we had the event, which I think worked well, and it was partly hosted at UCL, where we were studying.
Yeah.
Actually, people from the film collective that I was working with at the time, lots of these people were like Se and Funtram and some other people, Anna. These are people who are not known to the skate world because they're not in skateboarding, but they volunteered. They did all of the logistics for us, right? And they were like, "Oh, let's help these let's help these folks doing these weird things about skateboarding." So it was really this collective endeavor, which I really enjoyed. It was a DIY on like bottom up, we'll see how things work out kind of approach. And
do you remember how many days, how many panels there were for this first? I think it was pretty much the same between both editions, right? Like maybe 5 to 7 panels or...
Yeah, I think the second one was a bit bigger. I mean, the first edition was 2 days. It was 3 days. So we had the first day, which was kind of not fully public, which was an academic forum where we invited early career scholars. It was a Friday afternoon, early career scholars to present their work in progress, like master students, graduate students, or even people outside of academia who were doing amazing stuff. So we had a couple of people, I think, from the Concrete Jungle Foundation, those kinds of people who were presenting amazing work. So someone that I got to know during that day was Luke Cianciotto, who presented such an amazing paper, and I'm so sad we didn't record it. I was just like, this is amazing. So that was the Friday afternoon. It was basically 40 people in a room. We had some, moderators and discussants, so Ian Borden and Paul O'Connor, and I figured Brian Glennie maybe, some other people, I think Adelina, some of these skate scholars, we invited them as discussants to then respond to these upcoming new gen skate scholars.
Okay.
And then we had the Saturday at UCL with, I think, it's been a while, I think 3 or 4 panels. And then the second day we hosted at the House of Vans. We had some workshops like t-shirts making, like sticker making, those kinds of things. We had a photo exhibition, some other stuff, and then another few panels, which was basically the screening space that we turned into a place for, for this panel discussion. And the space was way too small. There were lots of people outside of that room trying to get in. There were no more spaces, so we set up this massive screen where people could watch that panel unfolding.
Okay.
And then the second edition, I think, was 4 days, but fewer panels each day because we had these morning sessions, which were mainly hosted by Skate Malmö, So we had the morning sessions by Skate Malmö and then the afternoon PB, or then the other way around. Because we thought, like, based on the first edition, attending 4 panels a day, which are really intense and heavy topics, people stayed, people were not complaining at all.
Yeah, but it must be a lot of...
You were exhausted, and there was no time to actually chat and to meet people and to set up new, networks or collaborations.
Sure.
And that was really a massive part, of course, of
course,
what we tried to do. So we tried to kind of spread it out over more days,
And do you remember the second edition being a bit more relaxed, so to speak, in regards to the first one, since it was on it was 4 days, and it was like only the afternoons for the panel talks? Do you remember it being a bit more chill somewhat, or?
In terms of organizing or attending?
Both, I guess.
I mean, organizing, no, not at all, because all of a sudden there was this, this expectation like, oh, we've pulled this off once. There's some media coverage. People seem to like it, I guess.
Yeah.
So now, we had a chat with people from Skate Malmö and the municipality and the museum in Kristianstad who wanted to do pushing borders in Malmö. But then, of course, there was this pressure, we had to do it well, and we had to learn from this stuff.
To deliver,
and we didn't get paid for it at all. So we were all working on different kinds of projects, all on very precarious, at least most of us on precarious contracts at our jobs, and then doing pushing borders on the side. But then it was not really a side project anymore, putting together a 4 or 5 day festival in a city that we didn't live in. So in terms of organizing, not at all. And so if I speak for myself, I was in a way happy that we didn't really have to do the third edition in 2020, that we could take a bit of time off in terms of expectations and the pressure. But in terms of attendance, well, it's hard for me to say because I was there as an organizer too, right? So I was just like checking in on the volunteers and the people speaking on the panels and stuff. But I think for many of the attendees, I think it was a much more of a relaxed experience, also because there were many more skate sessions. There was the DIY build, the bowl was being made and kind of opened, and we had a festival, like a film festival, like Smorgasbord Film Festival, like a photo exhibition. So I feel as though there was much more space for people just to explore the city and hang out and not just listen to intellectual people talk about skateboarding, which you maybe can do for a couple of hours a day and then just want to go for a nice chat and drink and stuff. So I think that in terms of a format worked better, yeah.
And what about like involving sponsors? Because I guess for the first edition, since it was a brand new event and the first ever like international conference about skateboarding, was it like difficult to get financial support from brands, from sponsors? And I assume for the second edition, after the success of the first one, it was probably easier to get people on board. But like, how difficult was it for the first one?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't really feel like it was difficult, also because we didn't really have any goal in terms of the budget that we needed. We felt like, okay, we'll apply for some stuff and we'll just make it work. And if we get like a few hundred, then we'll just make do. If we get more, we can do some more. So it didn't really feel like a massive effort. Most of the money that we actually got was from, university funds. So lots of it was from UCL and some other UK-based universities. I know like there was something in the north of England. Some people applied for some minor funds. Also in the US, a few small things, but that was really to basically fly people to London, right? That was the major fund that we needed, or to get some hotel rooms, though many people just crashed, everyone's floors. And so the way that it happened, at least the parts that I was involved in, was that Tom and I, being based at UCL, we were eligible along with Ian to apply for funds at UCL. So we would just, send some documents back and forth and just, try to kind of describe what this could be. Why this is important, how UCL as a university could benefit from it. And the backing of Ian was crucial, because he was a full, professor at the time, working on skateboarding for 20 years. So the university was a bit more, understanding, that this is something that is important.
Yeah.
And then, so we got a substantial budget through university funds, and then we didn't really have many, skate-related sponsorships, like in terms of money, but it was more like in-kind support. House of Vans offered their location to us, and Free Skateboard Magazine offered, coverage, and it was more like that kind of support that was offered from the skate industry.
Okay.
And then for the second edition, of course, you're in a completely different position, also working together with Skate Malmö, who already are working with skate brands, and that changes a lot. But we still had to, find money for the event, because basically the main expenditure was travel costs and accommodation. And especially for international people who we really wanted to be there, that was a massive kind of investment. And something that we didn't really want to compromise on. For instance, US-based academics, usually they have access to funds themselves to go to conferences. So that was not really an issue. But the main thing that we wanted to realize is that people who historically have not been able to go to Europe or to go to events like these, who are kind of historically excluded, or who don't have access to passports or to visa, those kinds of things, we just wanted to make sure that, people from Palestine or, those kinds of places could also visit Malmö. So that was something that we fought hard for, but also strengthened our kind of negotiation position, because what skate brand would be against, bringing people for the first time to an event like this? Because it means it can mean quite a bit in terms of that networking. And the main kind of condition that we had is that we didn't want to have any branding during the event. So we didn't want a huge swoosh,
big
like nice
DC Shoes logo.
Exactly. And the reason for that is that, we didn't want to have, sponsored panels. And the reason for that is that we were touching upon such challenging, complex topics like mental health in skateboarding, like inclusivity, diversity, but also kind of how we work towards more, skate-friendly cities. That there's so many kinds of agendas there, and we didn't want to compromise on that end. We wanted people to be able to talk freely on those panels. And of course, there's only so much that we can do as organizers, but we wanted to at least make sure that we invited them with money or with funds that didn't have any strings attached to it, Yeah,
that's interesting. I didn't know that you basically were able to finance most of the guests, or like the people on the talks, for example, on the panel talks, their plane tickets were paid for by pushing borders. I think that's great because, of course, then you probably wouldn't have gotten this diverse group of people on stage to do these talks, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, and the point is, I think that many things that we could have improved on in terms of the programming and the curation and who's on the panels and the voices that were not present and all of these kinds of things. So I also don't want to kind of make this claim that Pushing Borders is amazing, because I think we are still kind of...
There's always room for improvement.
Yes. But one of the things, there were two things. One, and that was for Pushing Borders. One, we had to really fight hard for the event to be free, freely accessible to anyone. Because university conferences, usually you have to kind of pay a fee to attend them or to speak on them. And we thought that would be actually, the opposite of what we have to do in order to make skateboarding accepted within academia, but also how to make academia and more critical work accepted within the skate community. So it had to be free of charge, for everyone.
Sure.
That was for the first edition, the main challenge. And for the second edition, it was really about, if you expand your horizon and if you're no longer mainly focusing on Europe, on our direct networks, right? Which we did, of course, for the first edition, because you only, could expand that far. And it's easier for people to kind of sleep on someone's floor, etc. But then for the second edition, it was not our hometown, but then also we wanted to do it in a professional way and make sure that people have a good time and a good night's rest.
Yeah.
The premise was, if you're an invited panelist, we pay for your travel and we pay for your accommodation. And that sounds really nice, but then as organizers, it's also, quite a difficult thing to achieve. But
I'm sure, yeah.
In a way, we pulled it off, luckily.
You certainly did, yeah, absolutely. And so you just mentioned earlier that there were talks about third edition in 2020 in Bordeaux, I think. And of course, COVID happened and you weren't able to do this third edition. And I'm sure you've gotten this question from a lot of people since then. But why basically did you and the rest of the Pushing Borders team, why haven't you put together this third edition in 2021 or later? I'm sure you guys have thought about it, have talked about it, and there was probably many reasons for you not to keep it going. But yeah, can you maybe tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, so the first thing is that we wanted to be a physical event, and that was not really possible during the pandemic.
Sure.
It's not just for the panel discussions, but what we saw in terms of the ripple effects of Pushing Borders. Some of it is indirectly related or, is more like serendipity. Some of it is directly related, like collaborations between academics or between like some podcasters or like people getting sponsorships through meeting people at PB. We wanted this to happen. We wanted this to be a physical event so that people get to talk and meet one another. That was really key. And that was something in 2020, of course, was not possible. But then later on, there was always this danger of, another lockdown, etc.
Yeah.
And we didn't want, particular parts of the world to be excluded. Because even if Europe would be, or for instance, if you would organize it in Europe, which we had done in the past, then, say Europe, it's possible to travel freely in Europe, but what if some other part of the world is in lockdown around that time? All of a sudden it becomes this very exclusive event. So that was a bit more difficult. And then another reason, I cannot speak for the entire crew, but for me personally is that I took, just a bit of a break during the pandemic from skateboarding. I got my job at a university in the Netherlands. I was working on a totally different, unrelated project in media studies. And after doing the PhD and Pushing Borders and all of this stuff related to skateboarding, the lockdowns and being just by myself or with my partner and cat at home, teaching and doing some research on different topics was a good kind of break to consider my relationship to skateboarding. Because like I was saying before, I've had this, throughout my life, this ambivalent relationship to skateboarding. I love it. But then also in terms of the way that I have related in the past to my body or the way that I relate to, my peers in terms of masculinity in skateboarding, all this stuff that I also struggle with in skateboarding. So it was nice to take a break to find my new kind of relationality to skateboarding, reimagine what skateboarding could mean for me in the future, rather than repeating myself over and over again. So that was really much needed for me personally. And then Pushing Borders Malmö was quite intense to organize, and I know for some other people they also needed a break in terms of the workload that it led to. Not for me personally, but for some other people it did.
Okay.
And then the third reason, and that's something that when the pandemic, which I don't know, officially WHO says it's not no longer there, but who knows? But now it seems possible to organize these larger scale physical events, at least.
Yeah.
We've been talking about it, and one of the conversations we've been having is let's consider every option and any offers that might come to the table, but let's also appreciate Pushing Borders for what it was at the moment at which we organized it.
Yeah.
And we feel as though times have changed a lot in skateboarding. I think there's still so much we need to improve in skateboarding, but compared to 2017, 2018, I now feel as though skateboarding will be okay. And I didn't feel like that around the time. So I think skateboarding as an industry or as a culture is much better off now than it is,
it's in a better
6
place.
years ago.
Yeah.
And personally, what I want, if I organize something of the scale of Pushing Borders, is that there's an urgency to it. There's a reason for putting it together beyond it being a fun event, because there's so many already kind of amazing events taking place. And, I loved seeing Slow Impact. I couldn't go there, but
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Yeah,
so
Wheels of Fortune.
You didn't go, right?
No, I couldn't. I was teaching. These are the downsides of being a full-time academic. There are other people to take care of, and the students, they have to graduate, and I want to support them. I cannot leave them behind. But there's some other events and initiatives that basically are happening right now that I think are also doing some of the work that Pushing Borders was doing a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And personally, I would love to put together another Pushing Borders in the near future. And then the main premise would be what do we as a skate community need? What kinds of discussions need to be had right now, So that doesn't become this repetition of what we worked 5 years ago, but something that has relevance in 2023.
In today's context.
Exactly.
So you just mentioned Ryan Lay's event Slow Impact. Did you notice other events of that nature happening within skateboarding? Speaking for myself, I can definitely say that this podcast is largely inspired by Pushing Borders. I've had many guests that were people that attended Pushing Borders, either editions or both. So I've definitely taken huge inspiration from those events. But what other initiatives aside from maybe this podcast and Ryan Lay's event that he did a few months back? Are there other things that you noticed happening that you could really link to Pushing Borders?
Oh, yeah. I mean, maybe I mentioned some events, but I don't know about the link to Pushing Borders. That's something maybe for these people to say whether it's influenced by it. But in terms of the events, Slow Impact I thought was amazing. And I've watched both panels that were uploaded on YouTube. I thought they were amazing. And I think Ryan Lay, what he's doing in his career as a professional skateboarder, but then also with Skate After School and all of these things are really brilliant. And I loved that he kind of attended Pushing Borders in Malmö. But then also I think what he's related to too is the Event City podcast. I think the kind of discussions that were taking place on the podcast there, especially during the pandemic, well, now as well, but then in this period where I thought that there was a need for continuing these kinds of conversations, these folks were really taking it to the next level. That was really awesome to see. Mm-hmm. The Wheels of Fortune panels on skateboarding, I think, were really great. So that's an event that I really want to attend in September, hopefully, this year. I've been a huge fan of the heavy discussion panels. I don't think any of them have been taken place recently, but it's something that Jeline Liao started in New York, I think 2 years prior to Pushing Borders. These one-off kind of panel discussions. Those are fantastic too and have a similar format. And then there's these more situated local events. So next week, actually, there's this, I don't know when you're going to publish this, but on the 21st of June, I believe it is, or 22nd, there's this skate symposium in Rotterdam where I'm based. And Leo Vals is visiting Rotterdam to speak on his experiences in Bordeaux, to make it into a skate-friendly city. And as part of this, this architecture month in Rotterdam, and one person, skateboarder and campaigner, Kim Butter, who has been involved with SkatePal and was a volunteer at Pushing Borders, she's really been kind of pivotal in putting together that event. So I see lots of things happening. Yeah. And I'm really stoked. And I think, if anything, even if Pushing Borders never will take place again, what I say, skateboarding will be okay because so many people are doing these things and not just in one central location, but across the globe. So that makes me really excited for the future. Yeah.
And so, can you tell me about your current position at the University of Leiden? So, you're a teacher over there, basically, and can you tell me about your duties over there and maybe about some of the work that you guide for the students? Are you accompanying students doing their PhDs like you used to do? And do you also work with people around skateboarding, or do you focus on, I guess, a wide spectrum of topics? Yeah, can you tell me about your current position over there, maybe?
Yeah. So I started working at Leiden during the pandemic, I think the fall of 2020, initially as a lecturer and then since this year as an assistant professor. So I teach and I do research in anthropology, and the courses that I teach are in visual anthropology, which means that students get to do fieldwork on whatever topic they want. And besides a regular paper, they make an audiovisual piece. So that could be a film, it could be a zine, it could be an exhibition, a photo series, anything goes really.
Okay.
And I supervise these students. I haven't really supervised anyone working on skateboarding. There have been people doing work on like rollerblading and parkour and other urban practices, but not skateboarding.
Okay.
But that's something that I do. And I teach some courses in the bachelor's and also in the master's program at the university. And I really, really love that. It's small scale education. I get to know these students very well. They're all like incredibly engaged and activists. And I'm like, oh my God, if only I were like that, when I was studying. Because like I was saying, I was only interested in the topics that had some kind of practical, use for me.
Sure.
But these students, they soak in everything, and I love it. And their kind of awareness of the state of the world is just astonishing to me. They are so much involved in stuff related to climate change and sustainability and social inequality, discrimination. They really know what they're talking about, and I get really inspired by these folks, and I feel like it's a totally different generation from, of course, there was student activism when I was studying at my university, but not at this scale.
Yeah. It was a bit more marginal, maybe.
Yes, and so it's a really, I think, thriving community to be part of. And that really inspires my research as well. So I'm now I was working on a book version of my PhD. So the PhD was like 400 pages and 2 films, and I reduced it to I think 150 pages for the book and then 1 film. So I worked on that for a few years. And then now I'm really working on 2 kinds of projects related to skateboarding. So the first one is really related to skateboarding and failure.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of people have been writing about failure in different ways. And I want to really try to write a critique of skateboarders celebrating bruises and scuffs and,
pain.
all of these kinds of, and pain, the hustle, the self-made man, resilience, the hustle, the bounty of failure, those kinds of things. I want to kind of see if, academic work can offer me an alternative to thinking about failure, because failure is so central to skateboarding, but it doesn't have to be this very masculine,
stereotypical kind of
representation of failure. So I'm looking at kind of aging bodies that are slower and that feel fatigued and that are not jumping off of 20 stairs, but then they fall over, they tumble over like small curbs, that kind of failure. And like part of that project is heavily inspired by Skate Like a Girl and Kristen Ebeling. I think in one of the talks she did, she said but we have to move away from skate or die, but instead do something called skate slow and live. So I try to approach that kind of mantra from an academic perspective. So to think a bit more critically of failure and how that relates to our embodiment and the way that we move through the world. And
you shared with me this article that you did with Paul O'Connor on skateboarding and failure that I thought was interesting.
Yeah. So that's that piece that I did with Paul, which was I think we put it together in a few days. It's this kind of let's try to focus on it for a while and see what happens. And it just came together. It was a nice piece, I think, on skate videos and failure and the celebration of failure in skate videos. And so one of the things we try to do in that article is to actually say, well, so much of skateboarding is about anti-establishment and about critiquing authority and offering an escape from mainstream society. But then we're still so much caught up into neoliberalism and into the idea of the hustle and the self-made man and those kinds of narratives. Let's see what we can write about from an academic perspective and also kind of point towards alternatives. So I think Tired Skateboards is a great example of people who embrace failure, but not the type of failure that we're used to in skateboarding.
Yeah.
So I'm now kind of building it into a larger scale project, almost like querying failure a bit. Anyway, and the second project is really stemming off of my PhD because I focus so much on the representation of the city and imaginations of the city by skateboarders. And the PhD is really about how Korean skateboarders in Seoul try to represent the city through film and photography. And one of the points that I try to make, at least in the book, is to say that lots of the video representations and photographic representations of Seoul are basically showing unidentifiable space in the city. So you don't really see, you know, the Korean alphabet, or you don't really see the characteristic architecture of the city, but it's almost like this architecture that could appear anywhere across the globe. And my argument really in the book is that this is part of Korean skaters at that particular time, the 2010s, when skateboarding in Korea was kind of upcoming, to relate themselves to the global skate industry and skate community,
to fit
rather
in the
than
mold,
to
kind of.
Yeah, to fit in the mold, and then to seek cultural difference or seek difference in skateboarding more in terms of the way that they use their body, but not in terms of the architecture of the city.
Okay.
Anyway, so I'm taking that as a starting point, and now I'm looking more at the failed city and the city that is almost like collapsing because of climate change. There's not enough water to cool down the cities. Everything is crumbling. Some cities are trying to become greener, but then skaters are so much reliant on these gray-brown spaces, you know, asphalt and curbs and stuff. So what happens, not to skateboarding, but what happens to the imagination of skateboarding in a day in which cities are slowly changing? So how do skaters envision the future of skating in a greener city or in a more apocalyptic city if we don't succeed to, you know, adjust to to a changing climate? So it's still related to skateboarding and the environment, skateboarding and urban space, but more these imaginations of the city. So that's something that I'm working on, but it will take a while for stuff to come out. I'm really in the early phases of that project.
Okay.
And the university, they support me with that project. I had to, you know, of course, do some to write some application letters for my promotion to my new position, and I was like, okay, let's go all the way. If they don't want me, at least, you know, that's fine. But if they accept this, then I can work without any reservation on skateboarding. And they said like, yeah, that sounds cool. So this is what I'm doing now, which is incredible still to me, you know, to be able to get paid and to do this kind of work and have the backing of an institution like a university, you know.
To talk a bit more about like Seoul and Korea, because as you said, you spent a lot of time working on that specific topic or area. I was wondering like if you could tell me a bit more about how you've seen the Korean skate scene evolve through the years and how they've taken skateboarding into their own practice, if that makes sense, like how they've made it something very Korean and not necessarily, you know, kind of mimicking what people are doing in Europe or in the States. And how have you seen this evolve since you've been, you know, going there a lot throughout the years and everything?
So maybe what is good to know is that like skateboarding in Korea is a fairly recent phenomenon. So, you know, in Japan, skateboarding was already happening in the 1960s, you know, and Japan has this really kind of strong history also of surfing and skating. But that was not really the case in South Korea. Of course, you had the odd skater traveling to Korea to skate, but there was not necessarily this community of skaters in Seoul. That really happened in the early to mid 1990s when you had lots of skateboarders from Japan traveling to South Korea, but then also lots of the soldiers, the American soldiers being kind of situated close to the North Korean border and then skating, you know, during the weekends and during the evenings, right? So you had this really international influence on the kind of the origins of skating in South Korea. And so, you know, part of the project that I did was really to document that historical kind of trajectory and to kind of find the archival work that was, I thought, somewhere. I didn't know where it was, but what was the first skate shop, you know, and when were the first skate videos being made, and who is considered one of the, you know, the biggest names in skateboarding? Those kinds of questions were really kind of instrumental to that project because the documentation was not really there as much, or not in a more like structured way, you know. So that's what I did with my participants, all of whom were skaters or like skate shop owners or, you know, people working on skate parks, building skate parks. So I had lots of interviews with people, you know, related to skateboarding or the Korea Skateboard Federation in different ways. So part of the PhD is about this historical trajectory. But of course, I was doing this work in the mid 2010s, so that's 20 years after the origins of skateboarding in Korea. And around that time, there was so much happening in South Korea. So first, the Korean wave, what it's called, like in terms of K-pop and K-drama and the Korean movies, that was having a huge influence internationally. So there was a massive, interest in South Korean culture. Mm-hmm. And so that was really also focusing particularly on popular culture. That was one element that was happening. The second one is that lots of these international brands, New Balance, Nike, Adidas primarily, were heavily investing in the Asia-Pacific region. So Hong Kong, Southeast China, Japan, but also Indonesia, the Philippines, and really sponsoring upcoming skaters to put them on their team because they saw a huge potential for those markets, right?
Yeah.
Not just, for the markets, but also in the lead up to the Olympics.
Oh, yeah.
So, for instance, Anthony Claraval, who's been really part of the 411 photography and videography element, he, I think, was head of New Balance Asia Pacific for a while. And he also kind of did quite a bit of work in South Korea, but then some other companies. Vans was also heavily kind of investing in South Korea and skateboarding. So that was happening. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the third thing were the Olympics. So when I was doing my fieldwork, lots and lots and lots of skate parks were being built to train a new generation of skateboarders as, professional athletes.
Yeah.
And so there were so many things happening that were incredibly formative for the skate community. And I think one pivotal moment that I want to maybe highlight, if that's okay, is that, in Europe, we talk a lot about South Bank as a historical skate site and how Long Live South Bank, for instance, managed to secure it as a cultural heritage site, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we talk about Love Park and how it was demolished and how then people from Malmö, purchased some architectural kind of elements to then maybe build it up again. So we talk a lot about these historical sites. In South Korea around that time, so the early, mid-2010s, there was something similar going on. So you had this skate spot, basically, which was called Cult, which was located close to a massive architectural, infrastructure made by Zaha Hadid, this influential architect, internationally acclaimed. And so the skate park was going to be destroyed in favor of that massive project. And skaters, like in London, they actually joined forces and said, this is an important site for us as skaters. So much historical stuff has happened here in terms of skateboarding. We have to preserve this as a skatable site. Yeah. So there was a campaign set up and lots of negotiations with the municipality. And eventually, skaters managed to actually secure this as a skatable spot. And also negotiated that skateboarding should be part of this citywide narrative of sports or sports for good or well-being or, the way that public space should be used. And so that was a massive kind of win, I would say, for Korean skaters. Anyway, so my fieldwork really took place at that moment. And that was really fascinating because all of a sudden, skateboarding got acknowledged in multiple ways, right? Internationally, from these brands, locally, the municipality, but then also within the skate community, there was this awareness hey, we are a community. We have something particular to offer to the global, skate industry. Mm-hmm. And that was amazing. And one of the main things that my work focused on is this phenomenon that happened around the same time. There was a term that was coined in 2015 called Hell Joseon. Oh, and hell is something that we know, something that is not really pleasant, that we don't want to end up in. Yeah. Joseon is referring to the Joseon dynasty, which is this dynasty which took place between the 14th and the 19th century in Korea, the Korean peninsula. And that is currently considered as this, almost like this very hierarchical, almost like slave-driven society where peasants really didn't have anything to say. It was really autocratic. And anyway, lots of people who are Gen Z or millennials, they actually saw that what was happening in South Korea around that time, the mid-2010s, was actually a similar kind of dynamic where basically the government couldn't be trusted. You had these massive corporations like Samsung and LG and Hyundai. You had these massive universities. If you wouldn't go to any of these, you wouldn't have a future potential in that country. And there were lots of awful things happening. You had the sinking of one of these ships, that no one really helped with, and lots of people died. You had some other massive scandals. The president was involved in a massive scandal with Samsung. Yeah, all of these things happening. youth in Korea and also kind of like adults said like, well, this is maybe not a society you want to be living in. And there was this counter movement of people saying like, okay, but let's maybe imagine an alternative society where we engage in what they called useless activities. In Korean, it's like injo-jit, like useless activities that have no use to Samsung or to the government or to the country. And let's position that as our main identity. We are useless citizens. We don't partake in this bullshit society, right? These were their words.
Okay.
And Korean skaters were also part of that discussion. And part of my research is about figuring out why they felt this way, why they felt so strongly about the Korean society and Korean government, and how they offered an alternative to this way of thinking, this hierarchical way of thinking. And whether skateboarding could offer some kind of escape for them, from societal pressures. And so, some traces of that could be found. For instance, there were lots of people, a substantial amount of people who actually chose to have like face piercings or tattoos, which is something that doing tattooing is still forbidden in Korea, but then you could still have them in a more like underground circuit. But if you want to have a job at one of these, massive corporations, that's not acceptable.
I see.
Maybe in the Netherlands it's still a taboo, but it's not then, excluding you fully from the work field or the workforce. But in South Korea, that's still like more than just a stigma.
Okay.
And so some of my participants were saying like, oh, let's embrace that. Let's tattoo my face so that it's not that I cannot work at Samsung because they don't want me, is I show that I don't even want to be working there.
Yeah.
So there's active resistance
making a statement
against... Exactly. And to me, this is also, you talked about like what makes skateboarding in Korea like a situated practice. I think this is it. It has this very specific historical context as an anti-establishment movement, which in some ways there are lots of parallels with, the punk movement and the history of skateboarding in the UK, for instance, and also in the US, and surf culture. But then it is very much specific to Korea. And so the way that particular social structures and norms are being challenged are situated, right, and have really particular bearings. Anyway, this is what my project is about, and I loved kind of doing it around that time, because Hal Joseon as a concept is not used that frequently anymore.
Okay.
So like South Korean society is increasingly progressive, so there's increasingly more visibility for instance, people of different genders or people of different ethnicities and all of these kinds of things in like mainstream media. And so I did really that research at a moment of almost like a heightened crisis, like cultural crisis, which was amazing. And at the time, like skateboarding was booming. So that was really what my project was about.
Yeah, super interesting.
And to be honest, I stay in touch with my friends and, the people who took part in my research. I haven't been back since. The main reason is that...
I was going to ask you that, like, when was the last time you were over there?
So that was really 2018, after I submitted my PhD thesis.
Right.
Also to show my films and just to hang out and have a good time. And finally, I wasn't walking around with a notebook like, everything you say might end up in my PhD. Just like a different kind of capacity.
Sure.
And then after that, my life was being taken over by pushing borders and my work. And the moment it got a bit quieter, like 2020, of course, there was a pandemic, so I couldn't travel. But I've met quite a few of my participants throughout the years who travel to Europe, of course, or I speak with them online. Jinjop Kim, who is also part of one of the panels of Pushing Borders, he's the editor of The Quiet Leave, a skate magazine.
Yeah.
He did the photography for my book, so I spoke with him a couple of times, and I also kind of interviewed him for this article I did for Vice in, I think, 2018, based on my PhD.
Yeah, that's the one I read yesterday, yeah.
Yeah, so I've been in touch with lots of people, but I'm not based there anymore, so I find it difficult to now say, like, this is the state of skateboarding in Korea right now. But, and I'm not the kind of person, I don't like to fly somewhere for, a week or two. It doesn't sit well with me in terms of the environment. So if I want to be doing fieldwork, it should be a longer term project. And I hope it happens again, but yeah, who knows?
Yeah, actually, you just mentioned, this came up a bit throughout our conversation, but basically the fight against the climate crisis. You just mentioned like flying and basically sustainability.
Yes.
And I feel like that's one topic I don't see addressed that much within skateboarding. That's something that I'm interested in personally. I mean, a lot of people are, of course. Like I went vegan 2 years ago, and that's debatable whether it's, useful or not. And like I decided not to fly anymore, for example. Like I used to travel a bit more when I was younger. I lived in New York for 2 years, so I would fly back to France like every 6 months or something. And at that time in 2011, I didn't really think about it. I was like, oh, I'm just going home, whatever, and that's just normal. And now, of course, in 2023, it's like people are noticing much more that everything we do, everything we consume, whether it's eating, whether it's, products that we're buying, clothes, traveling, whatever, anything that we do has an impact on our planet. And we're seeing it more and more in recent years. We're seeing like the massive forest fires in Canada and France. We're seeing that more and more, but still, I don't understand why I don't see more talks about that in skateboarding. And I see like all these phenomena happening, and at the same time, I see skateboarding, like people are still traveling. We mentioned the Olympics, like people are traveling from all over to go to skate contests all over the world.
Yeah.
There will be the next Olympics in Paris next year. And like it doesn't seem like many people are, taking this into consideration and changing their life habits, so to speak, to try to be more sustainable. And I was wondering, like, what's your thoughts on that? Why do you think skateboarding is not addressing that more?
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're totally right, and I have similar kind of sentiments towards flying. And the caveat is, it's also for us, at least for me, it's almost this privilege that my parents are just in the Netherlands as well, so I don't have to. There's just not this need for me to travel, right? For some people, there's also different stuff at stake.
Of course.
But for me there isn't, and then I decide maybe not to. But I think you're totally right in saying that this historical kind of legacy of people traveling across the globe, and I maybe want to make a distinction between one, the environmental reasons, but then two, also just why people travel across the globe to skate somewhere else. And this is something early on my PhD, I wrote this paper and I never published it, but I just showed it to Ian and he said like, oh, this is nice, but now focus on Korea.
Okay.
And he was right in saying that. But maybe I'll return to it at some point. There's this lineage of skaters, particularly from Western Europe and the US, who are scouting unskated space, right? And going to China and also now like to Korea and to the African continent or to the Middle East and saying like, oh, but look at this almost looks like heaven to us. Like no one kicks us out. Everything is marble. We can skate here. And this is something that I find problematic because it has similar kind of rhetorics and narratives to kind of almost like colonialism, that it's space for you to be using. Whereas maybe it's not, right? And in my PhD, I also write about it, like what is my position in actually doing this in Korea? So being aware of this kind of sentiment, I think, is key. So that's one reason why I think we should be skeptical of, people traveling across the globe to skate a city for like 2 days and not really thinking about the effects it has on a local community, whether it's a skate community or not, right? But then the second point, and that's what you're hinting at, is just flying to, there was this video that I feel really angry about. I think it's a Red Bull video where they travel to Cuba and they say like, this is like uncharted territory, and just like skating there for a few days and then traveling back to the US. And it does seem to me that this awareness of the amount of pressure you're putting on the environment is just sometimes absent. And I think that if you earn a specific number, like a specific, set of money, and you don't have to think about, whether you can actually use water tomorrow or whether, you're not living in a place that has the risk of being flooded or that has the risk of these massive fires, like what you're saying in Canada. Or,
right.
Then this might not be one of your concerns because you just, move your family to a place where there's not such an issue, right? So maybe this is a personal take. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if there's something like a pushing borders or slow impact or something like that happening, or how like Wheels of Fortune, like this is for me the next topic. This is something that we need to be addressing. Like how do we deal with this? And that's not just in terms of flights, but then also the kinds of equipment that we use. But also the amount
I was going to say that,
the amount of media we produce, also in terms of digital sustainability, like how much videos do we need of skateboarding? And how much, pressure do we put on these databases, right? So yes, this is really part of my next project. Within academia, it is being discussed. So during Pushing Borders Malmö, there was a bunch of people getting together. I was not part of it because I was too busy running around and being anxious and stressed. I wish I could have joined that session. I saw them like through the window, like, this looks really fascinating, but I have to,
focus on other stuff.
Yeah. But like bunch of people working on it, like Indigo Willing and Paul O'Connor actually and Brian Glennie, but also someone like Clifton Evers, who is a scholar working on what he calls like polluted leisure. So all of these leisure activities like surfing and skating that take place in polluted environments. And that kind of generated this ongoing conversation within skate academia on how to like address this issue. And I know that Apache Skateboards, who are focusing more on indigenous and native skateboarders in the US. I haven't met them personally, but I know that they're also focusing on how we relate to our environments and the kinds of pressure we put on the land, etc. So stuff is happening, and more. So I think also because we cannot escape it, so it will happen inevitably. And there was this amazing article being published in, I think it was January of this year, which is called Skateboarding in the Anthropocene. So basically skateboarding in the day and age of humankind affecting our environments, right? And that really touches upon this issue. And it's a collaborative project. I don't want to name everyone because I'm anxious I forget someone, but at least Paul O'Connor and Indigo Willing and some other people were involved in writing that paper. And I think that will kickstart this whole conversation about the environment, about sustainability, about climate change, hopefully also outside of academia, because that's, I think, also something maybe that needs to be happening much more. And maybe the Olympics is a good starting point for that, right? Like, why the hell do we need to fly all of these skaters to Paris to then like put them in a generic skate park to all do a backside, to 70 to whatever lip slide they all did, like in Tokyo, all the same tricks, nose blunt, like boring skating in a boring hot skate park that no one cares about, but then still puts pressure on the environment. Whereas it could be something really great for skateboarding. Anyway, that's my take on it. And I think it's the next big topic. An issue also to address.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, I definitely feel like this should be addressed more, since it's obviously the biggest challenge we're facing today and in the next decades. Obviously, skateboarding as it is today is definitely not sustainable the way, brands promote it, whether through like digital content, as you said, through traveling, through all these international competitions. And of course, I'm not saying all of this should like stop existing, but even this podcast is a form of pollution. I mean, it's digital content.
Yeah.
So it's like, where do you find balance with all this?
Yeah. And what I really like personally, I'm like also going back, growing up in the 90s. Like I think maybe you're a couple of years older, but like skating around the same time.
Right.
Starting skating around the same time. Like there was also for me this romantic ideal of skateboarding in the US and the UK as being like totally anti-establishment, anti-capitalist, like really punk, underground, DIY, like really aware of social issues, kind of things. Like using the parts of the cities where no one else would go and taking care of them, like really making them a bit more beautiful than how skateboarders would find them. To me, that I'm romanticizing it because I didn't experience it myself, but I still have this idea in mind that this romantic ideal of what skateboarding was, like street skateboarding in the 1990s, this really rock and roll anti-capitalist movement. If only we would use some of that, and say like, okay, but how can we be anti-capitalist or at least a bit more aware of, the capitalist tendencies within skateboarding nowadays and see what kind of direction we actually want to be taking. And do we actually need a new line of shoes every year, right? Because there's something really amazing. And I think Kyle Beachy in his book, The Most Fun Thing, he writes about it is like in tennis, there's this yearly update of the tennis records, like the technical developments of the equipment that tennis players use. But in skateboarding, like skateboards haven't really been developing, since the 1990s.
Sure.
So that's amazing in a way, right? We have this tool that works, we don't need to actually lean into capitalism to make this fake improvement, the next edition of the somewhat more skateable like deck.
Yeah.
But we do so with all the stuff around it.
Yeah.
With shirts, with shoes, with, skate parks as well.
Yeah.
And let's think a bit more about how we can engage this more critically, maybe in the vein of this romanticized ideal of skateboarding as this, as this movement that can affect positive social change, which might or might not have taken place in the 1990s. But at least we can use that, mentality, whether it was true or not, to do this now. Yeah.
All right. Well, before we do the friends questions, I wanted to ask you first, what are like some of your upcoming projects? You mentioned a few things that you're working on.
Yes.
Then I have another question before the friends question. But yeah, tell me about like what you're working on right now.
Yeah, so this is, Quentin, this is make-believe. I use the podcast to just say it, and then I have to do it. What I really want to be doing is making this open access book with all the amazing voices in skate academia and the people kind of surrounding skate academia who are doing critical stuff on skateboarding. Mm-hmm. And there have been these collective volumes circulating the past few years, but I think it's time for a new one that is quite radical and rooted in skate culture. So I really want to edit such a book and to invite just these amazing people, some of whom have been on your podcast, and say like, what is the stuff that you think we need to talk about, rather than, oh, you've been talking about skateboarding and, you know, Korea, can you write yet another chapter on it, right? So let's push these boundaries a bit more collectively. Right. That's something I really want to be doing, and I'm now, you know, pushing for a bit of money from my department. This is also make-believe, and sending this to my supervisor, you know, but getting a bit of money to pull this off. This is a massive thing. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is I really want to learn more about skateboarding and skate history in the Netherlands. You know, I grew up in the southeast of the Netherlands. There are particular things that I think happened there that are really fascinating. I touched upon it, right? The socio-political atmosphere and around that time and place. But I want to know more generally about skate history in the Netherlands and also kind of the state of skateboarding in the Netherlands. And I moved back to the Netherlands in 2018, but I was focused so much on wrapping up everything and pushing borders. And then the pandemic hit. And so basically the past couple of years have been mainly just hanging out with friends, you know, and not really doing that kind of work. Okay. And I'm actually taking this summer to do some of it, to really kind of do research in the city or in the place that I'm based at, right? Yeah. So that's it, yeah. And hopefully meeting some new people, because lots of people across the globe have been popping up that I didn't know about, like you, and I want to be, you know, skating with everyone and just hang out. That's just a personal goal, really.
So I usually wrap up the interviews with this Sen question, which is a little bit cheesy, but I think can still provide some interesting answers. But it's basically, what's the most valuable lesson, according to you, that you learned from skating?
Yeah, Quentin, I mean, like, I listen to your podcast regularly and I really love it. And then I knew that you invited me and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to kind of formulate an answer to that question. It's like the most difficult question. It is. It's like choosing between your children or like those kinds of questions. So I don't know. This is just a provisional answer. I hope you think that's okay. Of course. So currently I'm writing this chapter with Paul O'Connor, who is an amazing sociologist. And it's on the prefigurative politics of skateboarding, which means like be the change that you want to see in the world. Mm-hmm. And maybe, you know, enact policy that is not yet there. And for me, like what I really learned is there is value in just trusting that the things that you care for is something that other people care for as well, right? And so when I grew up, no one cared for skateboarding in my hometown and at, you know, my high school and then university initially. And it was kind of being seen as a waste of time or waste of energy or both. Yeah. But I stuck with it, and I now feel as though I have something to say about it. I can make a bit of a change within it, even if it's just a really minute kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But just to kind of trust in the things that you're passionate for have future potential. And that's something that I tell my students as well. And there are students who are amazing at drawing, but then they're studying anthropology, where drawing is not a common way of sharing knowledge. And I say, like, yeah, just put it in all the papers that you're submitting. Just work on it. Every little drawing helps. And eventually you might not, maybe it's not even about finding a job, but it will become a meaningful part of your world and of your livelihood and stuff. So that's the stuff that I take away most. And that's also why, you know, on my LinkedIn, of all places, I actually say, like, yeah, I'm a skate anthropologist.
Okay, well, let's do these friends questions. So since we had initially planned, as you know, to do this talk with Danny Abelhauer, which I just had on the podcast, I have a few questions that were for both of you, but I have some other ones that are just for you, so it's a mix of both.
So my question for Sander is, it's been a while, but let's try and think about Sander's work that I've read. I really like the idea of skate academics continuing conversations with each other, and what kind of environments might skate academics have to continue those conversations, whether it be podcasts or conferences or just in the street with each other. Like, what's one of the sort of ways that skate academics can have community conversations, like maybe, I don't know, some pop-up arrangement, or just a cool way for skate academics to keep having conversations with each other, but also just with the whole community. All right, bye. Thanks, Quentin.
Is this Indigo?
Yes, Indigo Willing, yes.
Yes, awesome. I think Indy's work is so amazing. So I'm honored that, Indy was asking a question. Yeah, so what's the role of skate academics? For me, it's really about, on the one hand, like generating legitimacy, for skateboarding in terms of policy making, in terms of kind of negotiating with municipalities and stuff. I know that Long Live South Bank, they hugely benefited from the research on skateboarding and the use cases of skateboarding in a city. So they really leaned on the work that academics did on skateboarding. So I think legitimacy is a key part in that. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, and that's maybe more within academia, and Indigo is already doing that, and like she's a huge inspiration for me, is actually almost like creating, because as you might know, Quentin, like academia can be a tough environment to be in. It's like incredibly competitive. It's not always the nicest. Sure. High work pressure, like increasingly limited budget. And I feel as though skateboarders can actually like propose an alternative way of doing research within academia, which is more community driven, more collective, more generous, more kind, right? Closer to the people that we work with. And that's what I try to do, at least in Leiden, especially is to wear my hoodies and but that's a really simple way. But then also kind of when I go to conferences, I don't go to conferences that are being paid or that you have to pay for as a speaker, because I think that's really exclusive. So I'm very selective in what kind of places I go to, or when I organize something, I want to make sure that it's representative of the community that we talk with and about. Yeah. And I feel as though skateboarders are particularly well equipped to do that, to offer this alternative mode of doing research, and also to kind of break away from the increasingly neoliberal university and the increasingly competitive university. Because, while there's some competitiveness in skateboarding, there's also a lot of, solidarity and kindness and generosity.
Absolutely.
And creating these networks, that's something, right, we don't have to get into it, but initially that Tom and I and Adelina and Danny and some other people, we put together this collective called Reverb, this international academic collective on skateboarding, is actually to generate and foster these collaborations, to say, well, we are not competitors, but collectively we try and understand what skateboarding is across the globe in all of its diversity, rather than competing for, a place in a journal. So that's how I see it. Yeah.
All right, let's do the next one.
Sander, Danny, Lucianciato, I got a couple questions for you both. Firstly, for better or worse, we often have to justify ourselves in the academy in terms of what we're interested in. So why do you feel that skating, an interest in skating, is something that need not be justified in terms of your respective discipline? That is, why is it something more than a passion or hobby that we kind of collectively share? And secondly, I was curious about how you both balance your relationship in terms of being both a skater as well as an academic. That is it skater first, academic second, or academic first, skater second? Because, it's my feeling that how you make sense of this relationship or this question is pretty informative in terms of both how we participate in a particular space in a moment in time, but then also, whatever sociological or conceptual or theoretical fruits we hope to bear from that participation in that moment or space or process. So, yeah, how do you kind of balance that? How do you balance that relationship between both being a skater as well as being an academic? Okay, hope you both are well. I appreciate you both very, very much, as well as you, Quentin. Hope all is good, and take care.
Nice. Luke is awesome. I already mentioned him, right?
You did.
And his work in Chicago, for those of you who are listening, is just incredible. And it's really nice to hear from Luke. I haven't really spoken to him in a while, so nice to hear his voice. How to justify skateboarding in academia? I mean, it's a bit related to what I just said, but maybe in terms of the content in anthropology. So in anthropology, we spend a lot of time with a small group of people and we touch upon, sociocultural issues. And I think skateboarding is a great lens to look at those, whether it's about gender diversity, about environmental issues, about, power relations, discrimination, racism. All of these issues are key topics in anthropology. And to me, skateboarding and the skate culture, the history of skate culture offers so much to unpack about these issues, right? And I think we all by now know that skateboarding, while at the same time being very open and welcoming to many people, it also has this history of being very misogynist and, homophobic and racist. So zooming in on that from an anthropological lens, but then really using the framework of skateboarding helps me to do this research in a very specific way, right? Because if we talk about gender diversity, it's such a massive topic, and there's always the risk of then talking very in generic terms on a societal level, like, oh, gender diversity is important in politics and sports. That's true, but then we have to unpack it in very specific contexts, right? And so skateboarding is such a context. So that's how I usually justify it. It's basically this small, microscopic, replication of society.
Absolutely.
And then the second question, well, skater first, academic first. Oh, man, choosing one child over your other question.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
Luckily, I don't have any. I do have one cat, but I choose the one cat over any of these options. No. I wouldn't necessarily be able to differentiate them. So I borrowed this from Kyle Beachy. I couldn't have put this better myself. I think he writes in The Most Fun Thing, that he chooses to wake up each day and chooses to be a skater. That's what I do. It's not about, being out there and skating. It's about how you carry yourself, right? And your politics and how you relate to your peers, etc. All of this stuff that we just talked about.
Yeah.
And when I go to university, I have to kind of take a train ride of 40 minutes. I go there as a skater first, fully, and I have my this is something I choose actively, but then it is always interwoven with academia because I'm interested in these sociocultural issues. I want to understand them, I want to address them, and I want to change them if they're not going well. And that's very much this academic activist endeavor. So it's this kind of fusion, I think, of both. That sounds a whole lot like a Dragon Ball Z reference, that I am this fusion of two. Well, anyway, let's not talk about Dragon Ball Z because the masculinity there is also not great. But anyway, no, but it's really I actively position myself as a skater for representation's sake. But then in what I do, it is academic in nature.
Okay, this next one is from Charlie Davis from SkatePal. So he said, if you had to skate either a huge transition park or just a 50-meter piece of smooth flat ground for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Oh, Charlie, no. So wonderful to have discussion by Charlie. So I think Charlie and I, we are both flat ground skaters. He and I, we skated a lot in Malmö, and no, definitely a flat ground. But was it a slope, or was it just flat ground?
He said a 50-meter piece of smooth flat ground, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and I will invite Charlie there to do a game of skate. Yes, for sure. Anything that has some kind of shape to it is difficult for me to skate unless it's stairs. No, I grew up in it's more stairs and flat ground all the way.
Okay, let's do this next one.
Sander, long time no seen. First off, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for organizing Pushing Borders in Malmö. It really has been the gift that has kept on giving. A lot of people that I didn't meet but who were there have gotten in contact with me afterwards, and it's created this network of just good people that I still either keep in contact with or meet in other parts of the world who have Pushing Borders as our smallest common denominator. And that was all because of your work, and it was great work. My question for you is, if you were to organize it again, what would be your dream panel? What people would be on it, and what would they discuss? Hope to see you at the next Pushing Borders or in any other context. Talk soon. Bye.
Did you recognize the voice?
I'm thinking. You might have to help me here.
The vice principal at Briggeriets.
John Dahlquist, amazing.
Yes.
John, I consider John my spirit animal. When we the second time we visited Malmö, he invited us to the school and to his students. And if I could have this extra uncle, it would be John for sure.
Yeah.
He is And also in terms of, a role model for being a teacher and a skater at the same time, the way that he does it and the respect that he has from his students and the work that he's doing there is amazing.
Yeah.
This is a tough one, this is, Quentin, you've selected the difficult questions here. So there's this panel that I would put together. I mean, so the first person that I would put on the panel, well, is this in order? No, probably no, because maybe yes. I would definitely invite Candy Jacobs again. Like, she's a really close friend of mine. We worked together on various projects over the years, and I think she's done such important work for skateboarding in the Netherlands, and just an overall awesome person in terms of thinking about mental health, well-being in skateboarding and her skating. Oh my, it's just amazing.
Yeah, she's also a very talented skater.
Yes, and she got me back into baggy pants, which I'm really grateful for. I had my skinny jeans period, but Candy, thanks. So that's Candy back on the panel, and what I like is she's willing to speak up. She is not kind of being silenced by any brand. She is willing to say like, hey, this is what's wrong about skateboarding, but also this is what's cool about skateboarding. The second person that I think I would invite is this skater called Yuri Lee, who's a South Korean skater, and she has been really instrumental in setting up the skate scene in Busan, which is the second largest city in Korea, like a harbor city in the south. But then also like very much instrumental in kicking off women's skateboarding in Korea, which of course took off a bit later than the 1990s, which I mentioned earlier. So she's the second person that I would invite, I think. This is really tough. Okay, maybe what I would do is I would ask Tony Hawk to then do this, what he does in all the documentaries, just sit in front of his vert ramp and talk about how amazing people are. I would ask him to talk about how amazing Candy and Yuri are, but I'd not invite him on a panel. I think that would be really funny. So that's maybe the second person. Let's see. I really loved, this is maybe like a highlight reel of some of the Pushing Borders panel. Like, one of my favorite skaters when I was young was Jamie Reyes, and I loved skating with her in London, and she is also just awesome and funny. I think the Pushing Borders panels, if I were to do another one, there should be more space for humor and jokes and fun and joy. Right, and she is really embodying that. Like, she seems to just have the best life. And I want her for the vibes and her just amazing contribution to skateboarding on there. Yeah. And then maybe, then we have two people from Korea. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter because this is not real. I would invite, it's my panel. Yeah, don't have to kind of justify to anyone. No, I would invite this person called Jung Kim, who's basically my main participant or interlocutor in my fieldwork. And at the time, he was running the skate brand called Candle Route. And his English, that would be, really Charlie's Translation Park. And then we can invite him, or I can do some of the translation, or Yuri can do that. But I would invite him because what he's doing is really kind of thinking about the importance of local brands in an increasingly internationally competitive, industry. And I think those voices are really important to listen to as well,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that would be my panel. And 4 is the best amount. Anything beyond 4 is what I learned, from organizing Pushing Borders. Then it becomes too much.
Yeah.
So then there would be more space for conversation. Quentin, would you visit that panel, or would you say like, nah, I'll skip it?
Oh, no, I definitely listen to that for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe we should just do it and invite all of them to Rotterdam, like an evening program. It would be cool.
Okay, I have a couple more, so let's see. This one is from Adelina Ong. That was a question for you and Danny. She said, looking back at the past year, what is one thing that you've learned about yourself that surprised you?
So Adelina, she's also an amazing, you've only asked really incredible people that are really close to my heart, and Adelina is one of them. I've spent a lot of time during the pandemic actually talking to her, like on Zoom, chatting about well-being and mental health and how we do like deal with the pandemic while teaching and take care for our students. So like one of the things that I learned over the past year is nothing happens if you don't publish shit. Like, it's fine. Like, people will still care about you. People will still be your friends. I mentioned this tendency towards being highly disciplined that I have, just by nature or nurture, who knows, but I have that. And so I had this tendency to be constantly publishing and doing stuff and be constantly on the move.
Very, very productive.
Yeah, very productive. And on the one hand, that's nice, because then, sometimes you progress to the next stage in your career or whatever. But on the other hand, it also means that I was really bad at taking time off, like fully off, not even thinking about stuff. And that was my goal for 2022 and 2023. So I decided, like, in the weekends, I'm not doing anything. So you proposed a few dates to have the recordings, in the weekends. And I was like, no, I'm not available. I was available, but I said no, because I didn't want to then make it into something that is related to
compromise.
Exactly.
I understand.
And what I learned about myself then is I still feel the exact same about myself. I still feel happy with who I am, with my core values, with the stuff that I do. And I can do less of it. And maybe I can do fewer things, but more frequently, or fewer things and less frequently, or bigger things and every once in a while. It's all fine. And that was a massive realization that if you listen to any well-being podcast, they always tell you this. And I always listen to it. I'm like, yeah, that sounds cool, but I never really implemented it. But now that I did, I'm happy. And Adelina has been a huge inspiration, because she's always saying this, especially during that first pandemic year, like, stop publishing, start focusing on your teaching, and start focusing on, taking care of your partner and your cat and your family. That's it. So I took her advice to heart, and so back to her, she's been really instrumental in getting there. Yeah. And then we're recording a podcast over 2 hours. I'm not staying true to my less is more.
Okay, let's see this one.
My question for Sander is, if skateboarding has historically been centered in California, where do you think skateboarding's center is now, or is likely to be in the future? Thank you.
Is that Danny?
Yes, that was Danny Abelhauer.
Yeah, also my suggestion to you to do a recording with Danny together is also because then, of course, she's busy with her kid and family and all of this stuff. But then just to have 2 hours to talk to her. But now, anyway, so where's skateboarding located now? Where's it centered? So I try to de-center it from the US, like I do with academic work. I try to not cite only sources, even though they are like manifold and sometimes important, but not only, US-based academics, because there's also the whole politics to the language and the journals that are located and the economy of all of it. Same with skateboarding. So when I was at UCL, I put together this little pamphlet with Tom Callan Riley, and it was called Skateboardings with an S at the end. And for me, that's really what skateboarding is today. It's no longer this singular thing. You've got practices of skateboarding across the globe that in some way look similar, maybe in terms of wheel size or in terms of, what a kickflip might look like, but then in some other ways are totally different. And I feel as though decentering it does not mean we have to center it elsewhere fully, right? I wouldn't say like, oh, it's based now in Seoul or, on Ramallah or something. No, I would say like now it's hopefully more and more decentered, and let's keep it that way. Not just decentered in terms of geography, but also decentered in terms of the practice that it is. And so the kind of skateboarding that Danny does, which is more performance based, let's also consider that fully as skateboarding, and make more videos like that and less videos of 20 sets and So that's my response, really.
No, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. Yeah. All right, I have just a couple more, and then I'll let you go.
Hey man, it's Osh. I'm just wondering, do you ever get bored skateboarding? Is there anything boring about skateboarding? What is it? Is there, maybe it's nothing, but, maybe there's something. If there's something, I think you should tell us. What bores the life out of you about skateboarding, if anything? And we all know there's something. What is it? Tell us.
That's Osh, right?
Yes.
Osh Tamas, yeah. So Osh, yeah. So I know that when he was working for Skatism, I think he called a skateboard like a wooden toy, and always stuck with me. Like, it is in a way kind of downplaying what skateboarding is, but at the same time, it's actually saying what it is. It's a wooden toy, and that's it. Like the point is, like to me, lots of skateboarding is not about the spectacle. It's all about watching and resting and slowing down, and lots of it is boring. And I cherish the boredom in skateboarding. So like this little film, like it's a 35 whatever minute film that I made for my PhD. It's called Reverberations, and it's boring as hell. It's slow. Nothing much happens. People don't land tricks. We don't even see that many skaters. We do see skatable objects. That to me is what skateboarding is about. It's a whole bunch of waiting and just falling asleep and slowing down. That's what I love about it. And it's also about like we talk so much and we think so much about skateboarding, but then I don't know, Quentin, if you skate a lot, but I I only skate, every once in a while nowadays because of all the other commitments that I have.
Yeah.
And when I do, I love just hanging out and just getting bored and then just taking the newspaper or a book or my phone out. And so like my answer to Osh is, it's not that there's maybe one thing that's boring to skating. Lots of things are, and that's what's beautiful about it.
yeah, it's a beautiful boredom. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's interesting. This just makes me realize like how skateboarding videos are basically quite the opposite. It's like trick. There's like no space for boredom whatsoever. It's to put the most amount of skateboarding, I mean, for the standardized skate video out there, Of course, some of them are like a bit more artistic with a slower pace and everything, but like, but sometimes when you think about it, it's just like, it's like skate porn basically. It's like just thrown at your face, like, okay, here it is, and it's like, sometimes it's just too much. So I'd be interested in checking out this. Is it online? This film that you talked about?
Yeah, it's online. Yeah, it's online.
I'd be curious to check that out.
I can send you a link.
Yeah, absolutely.
And please tell me it's boring.
Yeah,
that would be the that would be a massive compliment. Yeah, exactly. No, but I've screened it, to skaters, to my participants and stuff, and they say like, "Wow, but it's not skateboarding. There's no tricks in it." And it's like, yes, but this is what skateboarding is like for lots of the time too.
Sure.
And I think it's really funny. But it is. Be prepared. It's slow, Quentin. Not much happens.
Okay, I have one last one.
Hey Sander, it's ace that you're on the pod. I'm really looking forward to listening to this one. I've got 2 questions for you. Firstly, you, more than anyone else, have been particularly smart about making a fusion between skateboarding and academic life. I want to ask, how have you managed this? What have you brought from both skateboarding and from academia to balance those 2 worlds? We've learned a lot about this from Pushing Borders, but I'd like to know even more. And we've spoken about failure, and perhaps you can reflect on that. Secondly, you have had some good opportunities skateboarding in Seoul and East Asian locations. What is one destination you would like to travel to and learn more about its local skate culture? Okay, sending love from the garden with the cats. Bye.
Oh, it's the also lovely Paul O'Connor.
Yes, exactly.
With whom I've collaborated a couple of times. So the first question about balancing skateboarding and academic life, it's working out all right. I would say the main thing is, like, I don't really compromise, and that sounds maybe egotistical, but I don't mean it in that way. I don't really compromise so much on my core values. So, like, I only decided, like, I will go into academia after my PhD, which was more like serendipity, and Ian offering that opportunity and stuff. But then afterwards, of course, that was a conscious decision to apply for these bigger positions, and you have to go through like multiple interviews and like stages of whatever. That was a conscious decision, and I decided, like, let's not compromise. Like, even when applying, I'm not kind of presenting myself as this amazing academic that only writes papers. I'm not. I make films that are slow and boring. I make zines, I make pamphlets, I make stickers, I skate, I bring my hoodie to class, whatever, and I won't shy away from it. I'm not going to speak in an fully academic way. I don't like jargon or like referencing to all of the scholars out there. I don't like this kind of stuff. I'm not compromising on it. Okay. And I will work somewhere where there is space for this approach. And then, it took me a while to achieve this. So my first job after, my PhD was a bit of a hit and miss, where some of the stuff worked and other parts didn't. But now at Leiden, I feel as though I'm appreciated for who I am and the kind of value that I bring to the department, but then also for my politics, basically, and for the way that I engage my students and communicate with them and collaborate with them and stuff. So that's part of it. And the second point is, I don't really, one thing again, Kyle Beachy, he's also been really influential the past few years, but he talks about skateboarding as being anti-rank and anti-numbers, and that's something I really try to cherish. So one of the things in academia that people get really upset or obsessed about is how many papers you put out there and how frequently your papers are being cited by others, right? And you've got all of these metrics, you can keep track of it. Yeah. And I don't give a shit. Well, I much rather have people who are outside of academia use my work for bettering the world than hundreds of academics just citing it, but it doesn't do anything, right? That's also part of the prefigurative politics, like be that kind of change and move away from these metrics and write the stuff that I think is important and that the world might need. Yeah, rather than the work that might do well academically, in that academic context.
Sure.
Am I fully successful in balancing it? No, of course not, because I'm skating less than I want to.
Mm-hmm.
It's only this year, like I said, that I'm taking my weekends off of work, which has been a bliss, but then it took me a while to get there.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I feel, well, I could be a bit happier with the things that I've achieved. Like my peers at university sometimes say I downplay myself a bit. Like, oh, Pushing Borders was just this conference, or there was like I can be happy with it. So I'm still need to kind of find that kind of confidence.
Yeah.
So that's maybe the answer to my first question. But also maybe I never get there. That's fine, Generally, I'm a happy person. I don't have to be proud.
Yeah.
The second one, where do I want to go? So the point is that I've been working so closely with lots of people working for SkatePal, with Charlie and with
Theo.
Phil and with Dorothy and Theo, like all of these people. And then Ryan and other people who visited Palestine, Danny as well. I've read a lot about it, in Danny's book, but in Paul's book actually as well. He has a chapter about SkatePal. So I really want to visit Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
But then I find it also really difficult to do that as a tourist because of the particular legacies and the political situation and like my role there then, So I don't know. That's one place that I want to be visiting.
Mm-hmm.
And the other place I want to be visiting, but that's a bit cheeky, I want to be visiting Exeter, which is where Paul is living, because I want to visit Paul and what he calls the garden full of cats.
Okay.
But that's not really maybe for skate history, but maybe just to see Paul.
Where is that actually?
In Exeter, I think the southwest of the UK, like 2 hours, I think, southwest of London, something
For
like
some
that.
reason, I thought he was still in Hong Kong.
Yeah, so he was based there for a long time, working there, and I visited him there twice. Once just during my field work in Korea, and once I visited him with Candy.
Yeah, I saw footage of you skating with Candy in a skate park over there, I think, yeah.
Yeah, but he moved back to the UK, I don't know, I think like 2 years ago, maybe? Something like that, yeah.
So you're a bit closer geographically speaking, but yeah, it's still not easy to see him every weekend or something, for sure.
And spiritually, I'm also closer to Paul now.
Awesome. Well, let's wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Sander. This was extremely interesting, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface of everything we could talk about, but maybe we'll do a part 2 sometime in the future.
Anytime. Yeah, thanks for the invite, Quentin.
That's it for my conversation with Sander. Follow him on Instagram at HollySander, HOLLIESNDR, and on LinkedIn at Sander Hölsgens. I'll put some links up on my Linktree page to some of Sander's work that we talked about throughout our conversation. Lastly, visit pushingborders.com to watch some of the panel talks from the 2018 and 2019 editions in London and Malmö. Thank you for tuning in. See you soon for a new episode of Beyond Boards.